Today I'm going to speak about 3 issues. The one is about poverty. I think that unless we can, in the world, get rid of poverty, it would be very difficult to talk about human rights, because people who don't have food, the first thing they think of is food and not about human rights. The second point I want to make is, how do we create a state which will enable public participation? Because we have to create a climate for public participation before we can talk about public participation. And my third point is, how do we mobilize the community so that it does participate in the affairs of the state and so on. Before I go on, I want to just read a small paragraph from this book. It's called Sarvodaya. It was written by Gandhiji in the early years when he first began to think about nonviolent resistance in South Africa. And he had read a little book which was written by Ruskin called Unto This Last. And he then translated that book into this called Sarvodaya. And I'd be very happy to leave this book with the Center for Human Rights after I've read this chapter, this little paragraph. The paragraph was written by Kumarappa, who is an economist, an Indian economist, and it's in the preface to this book. And this is what he says, and I quote, "The question that faces humanity today is how we may attain peace and freedom for all. Can we obtain them if we pursued the way of self-indulgence and aggressive industrialism with its greed for the world's resources and markets, and if we built up mammoth organizations backed by military might to control others for our own ends? Or should we rather go the Gandhian way of simplicity and economically self-sufficient small community organization wherein the individual will live for all through service and self-sacrifice? The two lead in entirely opposite directions. Of this, there is no mistaking. One moves inevitably towards hatred, war, and destruction. The other is calculated to lead to love, peace, and the welfare of all alike. The destiny of man depends on his choice between the two ways." This is what Kumarappa, an economist, has said. So today I am going to talk a bit about how I see, participation by people in the issues of human rights. I believe that human rights are closely linked to the type of government we have. An authoritarian government often violates many of the rights of people, while a democratic government should be protecting human rights. An argument, of course, is that while most democracies protect basic human rights, the fundamental issues of poverty and socioeconomic issues remain marginalized. We heard this earlier, and I'm repeating. I said that by being the last speaker, many of the issues have been covered by many of you already this morning. So I'm just going to reinforce that. On the other hand, it is believed that some authoritarian regimes have been more successful in addressing the socio-economic issues while violating basic rights and freedoms. Why is this so? Why are there more inequalities in a democracy than in some of the authoritarian states? Perhaps some would challenge this assertion, but many social democrats are now agreeing that a democratic order does not necessarily mean that questions of equity and social cohesion will be addressed. As we realize that there are many ills in a capitalist society, and that there are also many ills in a communist society, the need for new socio-political theory becomes urgent. The many mass actions around the world indicate the suffering and discontent of the masses. Social democrats are conceding that there needs to be a democratic order in both the political and economic spheres. A democratic socialist group in America states, and I quote what they say: democratic socialists do not want to create an all-powerful government bureaucracy, but we do not want big corporate bureaucracies to control our society either. Rather, we believe that social and economic decisions should be made by those whom they most affect. Today, corporate executives who answer only to themselves and a few wealthy stockholders make basic economic decisions affecting millions of people. Resources are used to make money for capitalists rather than to meet human needs. We believe that the workers and consumers who are affected by economic institutions should own and control them. Social ownership could take many forms, such as worker-owned cooperatives or publicly owned enterprises managed by workers and consumer representatives. Democratic socialists favor as much decentralization as possible. While the large concentrations of capital in industries such as energy and steel may necessitate some form of state ownership, many consumer goods industries might be best run as cooperatives. Democratic socialists have long rejected the belief that the whole economy should be centrally planned. While we believe that democratic planning can shape major social investments like mass transit, housing, and energy, market mechanisms are needed to determine the demand for many consumer goods. And this is what was said by young social democrats in the United States. So we see that there is certainly a move to look at new formations of governance, a formation which would ensure equity as well as public participation. The ideology of democracy evolved from people's discontent with authoritarian rule. One can look into the historic roots of democracy, but this is not the subject of this particular paper. So suffice to say that in the past 3 centuries, the world has seen that it has been through the agitation of people that authoritarian governments have been toppled in favor of new democratic order. and are underlined through the mass democratic movements. It's through these movements, people's movements, that these governments have been toppled. However, we continue to struggle to establish a participatory democracy where the power really and truly lies in the hands of the people. In a lecture at Stanford University, Professor Larry Diamond describes democracy, and I quote, he says, democracy consists of 4 basic elements. 1, a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. Most of our countries have free and fair elections. The second point is the active participation of the people as citizens in politics and in civic life. That is the second criteria. The third is protection of the human rights of all citizens. And the fourth, a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. So these are the 4 basic criteria for a democracy. We only see one criteria, and that is elections. What about the 3 other criteria, which we need to address? And he goes on, this is Professor Diamond, to observe that in a democracy, the people are sovereign. They are the highest form of political authority. Power flows from the people to the leaders of the government, who hold power only temporarily. A close quote. So in this lecture, I examine the second pillar of democracy, and that is the active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life. And I add economic structure as an essential part of this. So it's in the political life and also in the economic structure. I believe that there are other elements to a true democratic order which enable public participation. The first one, I believe, is an educated, informed, and interested population. If we have an educated, informed, and interested population, then they would firstly cast their votes by thinking about why they are casting their votes and for whom they are casting their votes. This requires that our education, and this morning a lot was said about education, our education needs to be geared towards providing the relevant information to people for them to be able to contribute meaningfully to the debates. Our education must be so geared that people want to make an impact. Raising their interest in the way the country works is important. What we see at present is that most people do not take an interest in ordinary issues of daily living until they are affected. And I'll cite an example. No one cares where the water comes from when we open the tap, or who ensures and how they ensure that the water is purified and becomes consumable. But when the tap is open and no water comes out, then we run to the municipality. So we have to raise the level of understanding and interest in the people about how these things work. There are many things that municipalities and governments do. How do they work? This is an important part of education, and yet it's not included in the syllabus. This generally does not form part of the school curriculum. For communities and people to participate, this program of education is important and should form part of education at all levels of learning. We can start, as Brother Dennis spoke this morning, you have to start from the kindergarten. You have to start informing, raising interest from that level onwards until the tertiary level. So this is the first point, that public education needs to be re-looked at if we want public participation. The second point I want to make is regular informed elections. Now, elections can be regularly held, but why do the people vote is not clear. Is it on the basis of manifestos or a kind of group identification where groups take a decision to vote in a particular way? Or is it because of charismatic leadership or a populist voting mechanism? Or whatever other factors that influence voters, we are not sure. I am not sure. I don't know if there are researchers here who can tell me why people vote the way they vote. And I'm sure you are concerned. But basically, the question is, are we making an informed decision that we will vote, and if so, for whom we will vote? Public education and not election propaganda becomes central to whether the elections are informed or not. The third point I want to make is that there always needs to be a Bill of Rights to safeguard basic freedoms. A Bill of Rights gives people the confidence to challenge any injustices and to mobilize and take action. It is important to guarantee this basic right to people. Among all the other rights, this is an important right. People in power can use their power to deprive people of basic fundamental rights unless those rights are entrenched in a Bill of Rights. Now, how does this happen? And I'll tell you that in South Africa it did happen. We used to have banning orders. People used to be arrested without any court involvement. When we had banning orders and house arrest orders imposed on us, no reasons were given. So it was all arbitrarily done. And this is a gross violation of human rights. But because we didn't have a Bill of Rights in our Constitution, we were not able to challenge this. We just had to accept it during the days of apartheid. This is what many of us underwent. And that is what can happen in a country unless you have a Bill of Rights. So in any democracy, a Bill of Rights becomes a very important part of your constitution so that people can then feel empowered to begin to challenge. The fifth point I want to make is accountability. After we cast our vote, do we hold our public representatives accountable? Election manifestos are produced, but after the election, no one sees those manifestos again. This then indicates that we, the people, do not take steps to make our representatives accountable to us. We don't hold up the election manifesto and ask them, this is what you said. Why aren't you carrying this out? And this is what we need to do. If there is an election manifesto, and most democracies have election manifestos before the election takes place, are we holding our representatives accountable to those manifestos? This is a question that we need to ask ourselves, and this is an instrument around which we can mobilize communities. And then the sixth issue I want to raise is instruments which can ensure that there is adequate and effective recourse for any deviations. So if our public representatives do not carry out this manifesto, the things that they told us they would be doing, they don't do, what recourse do we have? And it's important to have that in the hands of the people, the recourse to recall. You can recall a public representative. And so it's important to have that in your, Bill of Rights, so that when a public representative fails to do what they set out to do, they got your vote because they promised you certain things. Now, when they go into office and they don't carry out those, you should have the right to say, please come back, we want another person to go in there. And that is the right to recall a public representative. We should have that kind of a right. It is these elements that make it possible for civil society to participate in the democratic order or in governance. Now, I just want to see what Gandhiji believed and take a few points that he made about governance. Gandhiji believed that we have to create conditions for people to participate. We must create those conditions. And one of the suggestions that he made was that we must have decentralized local governments, little structures, villages, he calls them. Decentralization enables smaller groups within which power is situated to plan and make decisions. These come together and form larger municipalities. It is easier to empower, educate, and create active communities in neighborhoods than in amorphous municipalities and metros. The power in the structure flows from the bottom up rather than from the top down. I heard that this morning as well, from the bottom up, not from the top down. But it is imperative for the people to be informed and educated in order to exercise that power. Another important criteria is for people to be able to extend their concerns beyond the narrow confines of their own village or locality and look at the common good of all. This is a huge pitfall of our times. As travel and communication becomes more accessible and movement of populations are more prevalent than previously, what happens is that we have xenophobia syndrome. We feel that foreigners have come and taken our jobs away, have changed our lifestyles, and this sort of antagonism becomes entrenched in our society. Now, how do we deal with that? And the way to deal with that is to look at the world as our neighborhood. We are not Today, we can't say that Australia lives alone. Australia depends on the rest of the world. The rest of the world depends on Australia. So all of us are interdependent. Every little village can't live on its own. It is interdependent on other villages. And this is what we have to entrench in order to understand that if there is development, a lot of development on one side and no development on the other side, you cannot coexist happily. You can only coexist if there is equality. And that is what we need to strive to achieve. I know it is a difficult thing. Maybe it's pie in the sky, but everything starts with the first step. And if we have the conviction and the determination to start, we can lay the foundation for such a society to be realized, maybe not in this generation, but our children and grandchildren will enjoy that society. It's also very important that we have a just wage. Now, that also leads to equality. As I said earlier, if people are hungry, they are not going to be worried about human rights or issues of governance. The first thing they are looking for is food. And so a just wage and work for everybody are two important things to ensure that people are first taken care of, and then they can look at other issues in the community. Now, how do you ensure that there is just wages and that there is work for everyone? And that is the kind of society that we have to build. According to Gandhiji, he said that there is enough in the world to meet the needs of everyone, but there's not enough in the world to meet the greed of people. We heard this morning already that when we have huge, estates and so on the one side, and total deprivation on the other side, you can't have that kind of inequality. It's a recipe for violence. It's a recipe for strife. It's a recipe for unhappiness. And in order to create a good community where you can live happily together, you have to have relative equality and egalitarian society. And how do we have such a society? So this is what the young social democrats in America are talking about today. America, which is the biggest capitalist society. In that society, young people are already seeing that there is a need for social democracy to exist. And they have started talking about this. So we have to then look at how we can create structures, a government, which is going to look at economic equality and just wage and work for all. But apart from that, we also need to have a people-centered government where people have been given the opportunity to participate in the planning and programs. These are more successful than those that have been planned in a boardroom. So even if we talk about a socio-democratic structure, unless the people are involved in planning that, the success of that kind of a structure is going to be questionable, because people will see to it that this succeeds if they are part of the planning. And therefore, it's very important for people in government to always get the participation of people from the planning stages and to empower them by giving them information. And I will cite one example. In South Africa, one of the things that everyone is proud of is our Constitution. And any little child, any person in South Africa you ask, they will tell you our Constitution is the best in the world. And they're proud of it. The reason is when that Constitution was drawn up, every individual, we went out to every village. We produced little booklets, like comic booklets, where we explained what each clause of the Constitution meant, how that clause is going to affect the people, and then ask the people, so how do you think we should word this Constitution? What do you think should be in the Constitution? And we took all those ideas from the people and then drew up the Constitution. It took a long time, but that long time was worth the trouble because we went out to all the people. And today the people feel that it is their Constitution because they participated in that decision making. We also heard earlier about cooperatives, and Gandhiji also speaks about cooperatives. In his economic model, he does not accept the idea of capitalism nor of communism, but rather a blend of the two. He believes that where people can come together and set up cooperatives for manufacturing or agricultural industry, these should be encouraged. And they are what will empower people and will help to distribute the money equitably. Some such as steel, electricity, etc. should be owned by the government. He was of the view that, that if there are some industries requiring particular skills, then that can be privately owned. But such an ownership would be in the form of trusteeship. He spoke about trusteeship. So the assets and the capital is held in trusteeship. It doesn't belong to one person or one group, one corporate. It's held in trusteeship for the people, benefit of the people. So this is a model that Gandhiji advocates. Maybe it is an idealistic model, but if people begin to understand the value of this model, we can begin to apply this kind of a model. And it is the way that we can build a new society, a different society, from the kind of society that we have at present. Now, we have heard that whenever there are issues, and we all heard about the issues, and there are lots of issues of human rights that we face on a daily basis. How do you organize communities? How do you mobilize communities? And I'll tell you from our own experience in South Africa. Just one experience in a little township called Phoenix. Phoenix is a township where the Indian people, the Asian, Indian, South African people of Indian origin were removed from other areas and placed in this township. And soon after the township was created, the government decided that they would, and I'm talking about the apartheid government now, they decided that they would give them autonomy, which would mean that they would elect their own leaders, they would elect their municipality and be able to control their own affairs within that settlement. And now normally people would think, well, that is giving autonomy, that is giving some power to the people. And it's a beautiful thing. Why should we reject that? We should take it. We looked at this. Some of us got students from the university to see what does this mean for the people. And when we began to research, what happened was we looked at basic things like electricity, like water. And we found that if a municipality is created in this area, they would have to, they don't have the money to be able to generate their own electricity. They don't have a reservoir to be able to give their own water to the community in that area. So what they would have to do is to go to Durban, which is the big city, and buy the water and the electricity from Durban and then supply it to the people. Now, that would mean that these elected municipal representatives in Phoenix would have to pay the price, whatever price Durban charges them, buy that, and then sell it to the people in that area. When they sell it, they will have to, pay, or they would have to ask the people to pay an amount which is going to be equivalent to the amount that they paid to the city council. And that amount is going to be greater than the amount that Durban City Council was paying at that time, because Durban City Council was supplying the electricity directly to the people. Durban City Council didn't have to sell bulk electricity to another authority. Durban City Council had many industries around, and the industry usually buys a lot of electricity, and therefore they subsidize the electricity for residential. And Phoenix was only solely a residential area. So they would have to pay much more. Now we had to produce little leaflets giving all this information to the people. And after we gave the information to the people, and the people understood that this is what's going to happen. If we elect our own representatives, if we take autonomy, we are going to, at the end of the day, pay much more than we are paying at present. And that convinced the people to boycott and say, no, we don't want this autonomy. And immediately, we found women, men, children, everybody holding placards and demonstrating that they don't want autonomy. We remain as we are. And we won that battle because, number one, we educated the community. Number two, we went out and spoke to all the people. So when you have mass action, it was united mass action, everybody. There was no one who was against this, because everyone saw the logic in what we were saying. And they agreed that we have to protest. So when you have united mass action like that, you are sure to win the battle. There were many other battles like that, but I don't think I have sufficient time. I don't know if this is going to change colors when I stop, but I just want to say finally that active participation by the people in a democracy requires us to empower and educate people to be willing and able to participate. Gandhiji believed that unless we empower people, they will not participate, and the present order will perpetuate itself, not because it is the best, but because we allow it to continue. Thank you very much.
What kind of lessons could we take from what you're talking about tonight and build a community of activists? And, you know, as Jim Ive said earlier today, human rights really is about how we treat each other, and it is about our humanity. So.
Well, from my experience in South Africa as an activist and, you know, having participated in the freedom struggle, what we found is that the first thing that is important is for people to be dissatisfied, for people to be unhappy, and to talk about this, we have to go home to home and raise consciousness of the people and begin to make them unhappy about the situation, because often many of us leave our homes, go to work, come back, do our things, you know, mundane things that we do, and we don't even see the poverty. We become blinded to it because we condition ourselves not to see. And for as long as we don't see it, we feel quite happy with ourselves. So how do you raise that dissatisfaction in the community? We begin to inform the community. We begin to show them that there are these people who are suffering, that this is the plight that people are experiencing, and can we do something about it? What can we do? And have little house meetings and begin to discuss the issues of how we can change. What we've also found is that often people want to protest. Even today, you know, when you look at the many protests in the world, people protest, but they don't have an alternative. They haven't looked, they haven't thought about, when this government goes out, who are we going to put there? What is it that we want in place of what we have? So it's very important for people, activists, first to come together and begin to brainstorm what is it that, you know, we want changed, and how do we want it changed? How, meaning what do we want in its place? What's the alternative? And when we've got, you know, an idea of what kind of an alternative we want to see, we go out to the masses with the education material, telling the masses what is the situation, telling them that we need to change this, and asking them also what do they think is an alternative. What do you think, you know, would make all of us happy? So it's involving the masses, but also having some idea in your mind as well as activists. What is it that we want to say? What, you know, what kind of a change we want to bring about? So we call it conscientization of the masses, and that is a very, very important first step before we can take action, so that the masses are ready to participate in any kind of protest that we take. just another point is that these protest actions, we found, start from little communities. You find certain dissatisfactions in a particular neighborhood or something. You talk about it, and then your colleague may go to another community and find certain dissatisfactions. You compare notes, and then you bring those communities together. So you start in little communities before you bring the entire community together. So that is the way we plan these things. Mr. Mandela talked about the M plan, which is known as the Mandela plan. And although at that time when he spoke about the M plan, he was talking about cells where they would also look at how they can use, for armed struggle. But the point was that, his idea was that you draw little groups together, and then those groups join up together to form bigger communities. It's easier to take messages across, and it's easier to mobilize smaller groups than to try to influence large groups.
You mentioned governments being responsible and recalling of politicians. Something I had in my mind for a long time: how long should a government stay in office? 4 years, 3 years, or even annual elections? Thank you.
Well, in terms of politics, you find that if you don't give them enough time, they are not able to achieve the list of things that they set out to achieve. You need time. It takes a long time to build houses, build schools, to change curriculum, of schools. All these things take a long time. So perhaps 4 years, I think, is a reasonable, that's what people find. It's a reasonable time when, during which we can see whether they're going in the right direction or they're not.
What's it like being Gandhi's granddaughter?
It's a difficult question. I feel very privileged to have been born in this family, largely because I think, the experience of having, first-hand information about Gandhiji himself, about his life, about his ideals, living in a situation where we followed those ideals practically. For instance, his universality in terms of people. To him, all people were the same. To him, all religions were the same. We used to say prayers in all the different religions. So we would chant the verses from the Bible, the Quran, the Gita, and so on. So in that way, I was able to develop from early childhood respect for people as people without seeing them as a different race group or different religions, any of those social constructs that other people, grow up learning. So I feel privileged that I was born in that kind of a home and that kind of situation. But it also is a burden because people think that I should be like Gandhiji as well, and I'm not. I'm just me. I'm a very small person, and I'm trying to do what I'm doing, but certainly I don't know how far I meet that criteria. So it is a burden. It's something that I have to live with.
It seems to me that we're experiencing a crisis in democracy throughout much of Euro-based culture. And I would argue that that's because we've become obsessed with form over function. And I think as a society, we have stopped asking, what is the purpose of government? What do we want government to do and to provide for the people? And thus we get obsessed with things like how often should we have elections? What should legislation be composed of, etc., rather than stopping and as thoughtful societies that are attempting to provide social justice, economic justice, legal justice, not just for all citizens, but as a refugee advocate, I would argue for everyone on our territory. We need to really step back and consider both the purpose of government and the limits of government. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100% on that. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I feel that this model of the Centre for Human Rights here, which is situated in humanities rather than in law, is the ideal kind of model which I think should be followed by other universities and so on. Because I think the most important thing is how can we change human mindsets? How can we make human beings responsible? When you have rights, you have responsibilities. And those responsibilities are just as important as the rights. If each one of us carries out our responsibilities, then the human rights will take care of itself. So it's changing human beings. And I agree with you that that is where the emphasis should be.
How do you feel about the modern day ANC as opposed to how it was during the struggle and shortly afterwards?
Yeah, I think, during the struggle times, the ANC was a liberation movement. And all of us were in it without expecting something out of it, out of the ANC. Now, the difference is that a lot of people join the ANC because they want to get into government, because they want power, they want money, they want contracts and things like that. So you find that there is a difference in the kind of body, the people that are in the ANC and the reasons why people are in the ANC. But there's still a lot of people who are there from the time of the struggle and who haven't, become embroiled in this new culture of wanting positions, power, and money. It's positions, power, and money that corrupts people. And unless you want the position or the power to do something really good, and you go out there to do it without expecting, to take large chunks of the money. Now, there are very few people who think like that. and that is what is happening with most governments. You know, people go into government thinking that this is what they want, the power, the position, and money. And unless we can ensure that that is not the motivation, we end up with a government which is corrupt, which doesn't work for the people. I'm still a member of the ANC. I still hope that the ANC will walk the path of commitment and dedication that Mr. Mandela set for the ANC. And I live with hope.
In your life and all the work that you've been doing for human rights, for people, which occasions or which events or times have been like pivotal or really stood out for you as having inspired you and motivated you to continue doing what you do?
There were moments in my life, quite a few moments, when, for instance, people responded to the United Democratic Front, and we had masses of people going out there and saying that we are against this government policy and asking for a change in government. And that was inspiring. When people came out, you begin to feel, you know, that we've succeeded in moving the masses to come out. That was the one. The second, when I met Mr. Mandela and he spoke to us, at that time, I must say, although we in the United Democratic Front were, you know, non-violent, we believed in non-violence. We worked, you know, towards, we were hoping for a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist government. That was our ideal. But we were also angry. We were very angry people because things were happening. People, our leaders were killed. Steve Biko, if you read his life, he was a friend. I knew him personally. And when I read and when we saw what happened to him, it really made us angry. But when we saw Mr. Mandela and he told us, it's not this anger that is going to lead us to the democratic government that you want. It's love that will lead us to it. We have to, you know, love those people. And we said to Mr. Mandela, but how? How do you love a person who has, you know, tortured, killed people? How do we accept them? And he said, you can. You have to have the will and you have to learn how to love. And you know, you learn to hate people. You're not born hating anybody. It's a learned behavior. In the same way, you learn to love. And it's only when you learn to love that you can bring about this change. And I saw that my grandfather had said the same thing. But I hadn't seen my grandfather telling me this. I saw Mr. Mandela saying this to me. And that made a big difference in my life. And, you know, then we saw the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I also experienced, you know, my son was killed in 1993 in the violence in the country. And at that time, I had to think that if I am confronted with the perpetrator, I would forgive and I would, extend a hand of friendship so that the person can transform.